The fence post snapped clean through in her hands, and Julia Porter swore loud enough to scare the ravens from the cottonwood tree as the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the Wyoming grassland outside Lusk in 1884. She dropped the rotted wood and wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dirt across her sun-browned skin. The fence line stretched another 100 yards toward the creek, and at least a dozen more posts needed replacing before nightfall. Her father would have had this done in half a day, but her father was 6 months in the ground, and the ranch was hers now whether she could handle it or not. At 22 years old, Julia had buried both parents within a year of each other. Her mother had succumbed to pneumonia the previous winter, and her father had followed from what the doctor called a broken heart, but what Julia suspected was simply exhaustion and grief. They had left her 300 acres of struggling grassland, 40 head of cattle, and enough debt to keep her awake most nights. She grabbed another post from the pile she had dragged out on the wagon that morning and positioned it in the hole she had dug. The work was honest but brutal, and her hands were raw despite the leather gloves she wore. She had just started packing dirt around the base when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Julia straightened, one hand going instinctively to the rifle she kept propped against the wagon. Strangers were not always friendly in this part of Wyoming, and a woman alone was considered easy prey by men with dark intentions. But as the rider crested the small rise, she relaxed slightly. He was leading a pack horse and riding slow, and he raised one hand in greeting as he approached. "Afternoon," he called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. "Looks like you could use a hand." "I am managing fine on my own," Julia replied, though the words tasted like lies even as she spoke them. She studied the stranger as he pulled his horse to a stop about 10 feet away, clearly aware enough to know not to crowd a woman holding a rifle. He was tall in the saddle, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a face weathered by sun and wind. She guessed he was somewhere in his mid-20s, with the lean build of a man who worked for his living. His clothes were dusty from travel but well-maintained, and his horse looked healthy and well cared for. "Name is Lucas Bennett," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I have been riding since dawn looking for work. Heard in town there might be ranches hiring for the summer." "Heard wrong," Julia said flatly. "Nobody around here has money for hired help." Lucas looked at the fence line, then at the pile of rotting posts she had already pulled up, then back at her. "Begging your pardon, miss, but it looks like you need help whether you can pay for it or not." Julia bristled. "I said I am managing." "Did not say you were not," Lucas replied easily. He dismounted and walked his horse closer, and Julia noticed he moved with a slight limp. But managing alone and managing with help are two different things. "Sun will be down in a few hours, and you have got a lot of fence left to mend." "And what do you want for your trouble?" Julia asked suspiciously. She had learned quickly that nothing came free, especially not from strange men offering assistance. Lucas shrugged. "Supper, if you can spare it." "Maybe let me sleep in your barn for the night. I will be on my way come morning." Julia studied him for a long moment. Every instinct her father had taught her said to send him packing, but her aching shoulders and raw hands argued otherwise. Finally, she nodded toward the fence line. "You know anything about mending fences?" "Enough to be useful," Lucas said. "Fine. But the rifle stays close, and if you try anything, I am a better shot than my father was, and he once hit a coyote at 200 yards. Lucas held up his hands in mock surrender, but there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Would not dream of it, miss." He tied his horses to the wagon and rolled up his sleeves. Julia watched him pick up one of the posts and test its weight, then nod approvingly. Without another word, He moved to the next section of damaged fence and got to work. They labored in silence for the better part of an hour. Julia was surprised to find that Lucas did indeed know what he was doing. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and he worked steadily without complaint. He was stronger than she was, which meant the posts went in faster, and by the time the sun had dropped halfway to the horizon, they had covered twice the distance she would have managed alone. "Where did you learn ranch work?" Julia asked during a brief rest. She passed him the water canteen, and he drank deeply before handing it back. "Grew up on a ranch in Colorado," Lucas said. "Worked cattle most of my life." "What brings you to Wyoming?" Something flickered across his face, gone too quickly for her to identify. "Time for a change of scenery." It was not much of an answer, but Julia recognized the tone of a man who did not want to discuss his past. She could respect that. She had her own ghost she preferred not to name. They returned to work. The sun continued its descent, painting the grassland in shades of amber and gold. Julia found herself studying Lucas when she thought he was not looking. He moved well despite the limp, and there was something steady about him, something that reminded her of her father. Not in looks, but in the quiet competence of a man who knew his work and did it without fanfare. "You run this place alone?" Lucas asked as they started on the final section of fence. "Since my father passed 6 months ago," Julia said. She did not mention her mother. One grief was enough to share with a stranger. "That is a lot of ranch for one person." "I am aware. Any other family?" "Brothers, cousins?" "No one." Lucas hammered in another post before speaking again. "Town mentioned the Porter place when I asked about work. Did not realize it was run by a woman." Julia felt her jaw tighten. "A woman can run a ranch just as well as any man." "Did not say she could not," Lucas replied mildly. "Just making an observation." They finished the last post as the sun touched the horizon. Julia stepped back and surveyed their work. The fence line ran straight and true, the new post solid in the ground. What would have taken her until dark and left her too exhausted to do anything but collapse had been finished with time to spare. "You do good work," she admitted grudgingly. "You too," Lucas said. "Though you might want to soak those hands tonight. They look raw." Julia glanced down at her palms. Even through the gloves, blisters had formed. "They have been worse." They loaded the old posts and tools back onto the wagon. The horses whickered softly as they approached, and Lucas paused to stroke his gelding's neck with obvious affection. Julia found herself watching the gesture. A man who treated his animals well usually had some good in him. The ride back to the ranch house was quiet. The evening air had cooled slightly, and a breeze rustled through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The land stretched out in all directions, empty and vast and beautiful in a harsh way that Julia had learned to love. The ranch house was modest, built from timber and stone by her grandfather 30 years earlier. It sat in a small hollow protected from the worst of the winter winds, with a barn and a few outbuildings scattered nearby. A vegetable garden struggled along one side of the house, and chickens pecked in their coop. Julia pulled the wagon up to the barn and set about unhitching the team. Lucas helped without being asked, moving around the horses with practiced ease. Together they got the animals settled and fed, and Julia showed him where he could stable his own horses for the night. "Water pump is by the house," she said. "You can wash up while I get supper started. Just stay out here until I call you." Lucas nodded his understanding. Julia walked to the house alone, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. She had grown used to the silence over the past months, but having another person around, even briefly, reminded her how lonely the place had become. She washed her face and hands in the basin by the door, wincing as the water hit her blisters, then set about preparing supper. There was not much in the larder, but she managed to put together a decent meal of salt pork, beans, and cornbread. She set the table for two, then hesitated before going to the door. Lucas was sitting on the porch step, his hat beside him, looking out at the darkening land. He had washed the dust from his face and hands, and his hair was damp at the edges. He looked up as she appeared. "Supper is ready," Julia said. He stood and followed her inside, removing his boots at the door without being asked. The interior of the house was simple but clean, with a large main room that served as kitchen and living space, and two smaller bedrooms beyond. Lucas took in the details quietly, and Julia wondered what he saw. A woman barely keeping things together, probably. They sat down to eat, and for a few minutes, there was no sound but the scrape of utensils on plates. Lucas ate steadily but not greedily, with the focused attention of a man who had sometimes gone hungry and did not take food for granted. "This is good," he said. "Thank you." "It is just beans and pork," Julia replied. "It is a home-cooked meal which I have not had in a while, so thank you." Julia felt something soften slightly in her chest. "Where have you been staying?" "Camped, mostly. Sometimes a boarding house if I can find work for a few days." "You have been drifting," something like that. Julia wanted to ask more, but she bit back the questions. It was none of her business why a capable man was wandering alone through Wyoming. She focused on her own plate instead. "How long have you been running the ranch alone?" Lucas asked after a while. "6 months, like I said. You have any help at all?" "A man from town comes by twice a week to help with the heavy work, but he has got his own place to run, so he cannot give me more time." "What about the cattle?" "What about them? 300 acres, you probably have got 40, 50 head. They need regular tending, especially coming into summer." 42 head, Julia said, "and I manage. I am sure you do." Lucas sopped up the last of his beans with a piece of cornbread, but managing and thriving are not the same thing. "Is that so?" Julia said coolly. Lucas met her eyes. "I am not trying to insult you, just stating facts. This ranch needs regular help, or you will work yourself to death trying to keep it running. I do not have money for regular help. The bank is breathing down my neck as it is, and if I do not make enough from this year's cattle sale, I will lose the place anyway." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with the fear that woke her at 3 in the morning and would not let her rest. Lucas was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "What if I stayed?" he said finally. Julia stared at him. "What? What if I stayed and worked? You cannot pay me, but you can feed me and give me a place to sleep. That is more than I have got now. And when you sell the cattle, if there is profit, you can pay me a share then." "Why would you do that?" Julia asked suspiciously. "You do not know me. This is not your problem." Lucas leaned back in his chair. "I need a place to be for a while. Somewhere quiet where I can work and not have to keep moving. You need help. Seems like it could benefit us both. There has to be more to it than that." "There is not." His voice was firm but not defensive. "I am tired of drifting. I want to work a ranch again to have a purpose. If that helps you keep this place, then we both win." Julia studied him across the table. Every sensible bone in her body said this was a terrible idea. She did not know this man. He could be running from the law or have debts or a wife he had left behind. Letting him stay was foolish at best and dangerous at worst. But another voice whispered that she was drowning here, that the ranch was slowly crushing her under its weight, and that refusing help out of pride was its own kind of foolishness. "I cannot pay you until after the sale," she said slowly, "and that is only if there is any profit. I understand. You sleep in the barn. You do not come to the house unless I invite you, and if I tell you to leave, you leave immediately." "Fair enough." Julia took a breath. "Then I suppose you can stay. For now." Lucas nodded once. You will not regret it." "I already regret it," Julia said, but there was no heat in the words. A small smile crossed Lucas's face, the first real expression of warmth she had seen from him. It changed his whole face, softening the hard edges and revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the weathered exterior. They cleaned up the supper dishes together, working in a silence that was more comfortable than it had any right to be. When everything was put away, Lucas collected his hat and headed for the door. "Thank you for the meal," he said, "and for taking a chance." "Do not make me regret it," Julia replied. He touched his hat brim and disappeared into the darkness. Julia closed and locked the door behind him, then stood for a long moment with her hand on the wood. She had just invited a strange man to live and work on her ranch. Her father would have called her 10 kinds of fool. But her father was not here anymore, and Julia had to make her own decisions now, foolish or otherwise. She went to bed that night with her rifle propped beside the door and slept fitfully, waking at every sound. But morning came without incident, and when she emerged from the house at first light, she found Lucas already up and working. He had mucked out the stalls, fed the horses, and was repairing a broken hinge on the chicken coop. "Morning," he called when he saw her. "Coffee is on the stove." "I made a pot." Julia blinked in surprise. She walked into the barn and found he had set up a small camp in the tack room, with his bedroll neatly arranged and his gear organized in one corner. A small spirit stove sat on an upturned crate, and sure enough, a battered coffee pot burbled cheerfully. "Figured you would want some," Lucas said, appearing in the doorway. "I take mine black, but I've got some sugar if you want it." "Black is fine," Julia said. He poured 2 cups and handed her one. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot and exactly what she needed. They stood in the cool morning air, steam rising from their cups, and watched the sun paint the sky pink and gold. "What do you want me to start with today?" Lucas asked. Julia had a mental list a mile long. "The north pasture fence needs checking. Some of the cattle have been bunching up near the creek, and I want to make sure they are not getting through to the Wilson property. He is already mad about the water rights dispute, and I do not need to give him more ammunition." "I can handle that. What will you be doing?" "Riding into town. I need supplies and to talk to the bank." Her mouth tightened. "Try to buy myself another month." Lucas nodded. "Want company? I am decent at talking to bank managers." "No," Julia said quickly. "I need to do this myself." "Understood." She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You are being awfully agreeable for a man who just signed on to work a failing ranch for no pay." "Ranch is not failing," Lucas said. "Just struggling. There is a difference. Feels like failing from where I am standing." "That is because you have been doing it alone and you are tired. Things look different when you have got help." Julia wanted to argue, but she did not have the energy. She finished her coffee and handed him back the cup. "North pasture and Lucas. If you find any real problems with the fence, come find me. I need to know everything that is going wrong." "Will do." She watched him walk away toward the barn to saddle a horse, his movements easy and efficient. Despite everything, she felt a small flutter of something that might have been hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. The ride to Lusk took an hour. Julia used the time to rehearse what she would say to Mr. Cartwright at the bank. She needed an extension on the loan payment, needed him to believe she could turn the ranch around. The words felt hollow, even in her own mind. The town was modest, a collection of wooden buildings huddled along the main street. The bank sat on the corner, a 2-story structure that tried to look more prosperous than the surrounding businesses. Julia tied her horse outside and took a breath before walking in. Mr. Cartwright's office was in the back. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanently disappointed expression of someone who dealt in numbers all day. He looked up as Julia knocked on the open door. "Miss Porter," he said without enthusiasm, "I was wondering when you would come by." "I need to talk about the payment," Julia said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "The payment that was due last week." "Yes, that one. I need more time." Cartwright leaned back in his chair. "Miss Porter, we have had this conversation before. Your father took out that loan expecting to be able to pay it back. He made promises." "My father is dead," Julia said bluntly. "I am the one trying to keep those promises now, and struggling from what I hear." Julia bit back a sharp response. "I am working on it. I just need until after the cattle sale. If I can get a decent price, I will be able to make the payment with interest. And if you do not get a decent price, then we will have this conversation again. But I am asking you to give me until September, 3 months. That is all." Cartwright removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "The bank cannot continue extending credit indefinitely, Miss Porter. You understand that?" "I understand that if you foreclose, you get a run-down ranch with questionable water rights and a neighbor who will fight you on every boundary dispute. If you give me time, you get your money and the problem goes away." A flicker of something that might have been respect crossed Cartwright's face. "You drive a hard bargain. I am fighting for my home." He was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "September. But Miss Porter, if you cannot make the payment then, I will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings. The board will not allow any more extensions." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. I will not forget this. See that you do not." He replaced his spectacles. "And Miss Porter, I heard you hired help. That is a good sign. Your father was a proud man, but pride does not keep a ranch running." Julia left the bank feeling like she could breathe again. 3 months. She had 3 months to make this work. It was not much, but it was something. She picked up supplies at the general store, traded eggs for flour with Mrs. Henderson, and gathered the mail. There were a few bills, a letter from a cousin back east she barely remembered, and a notice about the county fair in August. She tucked everything into her saddlebag and headed home. Lucas was waiting when she got back, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. He stood as she dismounted. "How did it go?" he asked. "Got an extension until September," Julia said. She felt suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline of the morning draining away. 3 months to save the ranch. "Then we better get to work." Over the next few weeks, Julia discovered that Lucas Bennett was a man of his word. He worked from dawn until dusk without complaint, tackling the endless list of tasks that had been piling up for months. Together they repaired fences, cleared brush, checked the cattle, and slowly brought the ranch back from the edge of falling apart. Lucas proved to be more than just a capable worker. He understood cattle and land in a way that spoke of deep experience. He noticed things Julia had missed, like the early signs of foot rot in one of the calves and a natural spring that could be developed to improve the water situation. He was patient with the animals and careful with the equipment, and he never complained about the hard labor or simple food. More than that, he was good company. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk while the sun set. Lucas told stories about his time working ranches in Colorado, about horses he had known and storms he had weathered. He was funny in a dry, understated way that caught Julia off guard and made her laugh despite herself. Julia found herself looking forward to those evening conversations. Lucas listened when she talked about her parents, about her fears for the ranch, about the weight of trying to do everything alone. He did not offer empty reassurances or try to fix everything. He just listened, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. One evening, about 3 weeks after he had arrived, Julia finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Why did you really leave Colorado?" Lucas was quiet for a long time. The sun had set, and fireflies danced in the growing darkness. "There was a woman," he said finally. "I thought we would get married. Turned out she had different ideas." "I am sorry," Julia said softly. "I am not anymore. She wanted a different life than I could give her. She wanted town living, society, nice dresses. I am a ranch hand. I was never going to be able to provide that." "Some people do not know what they have until it is gone." Lucas looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Some people do." There was something in his voice that made Julia's heart skip. She looked away, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth of his presence beside her. "I should turn in," she said. "Early start tomorrow." "Julia," Lucas said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "Thank you for letting me stay. I know it was not easy to trust a stranger." "You have proven trustworthy," Julia said. "That is more than I can say for most people." She stood and went inside, but she felt his gaze follow her until she closed the door. The summer deepened. The work continued, relentless and necessary. Julia and Lucas fell into an easy rhythm, communicating in shorthand and moving around each other with the practiced coordination of people who have learned each other's patterns. Julia found herself watching Lucas more often, noticing the way his shirt clung to his shoulders when he worked, the way he smiled at her jokes, the gentleness in his hands when he tended an injured animal. She told herself it meant nothing. He was an employee, nothing more. The fact that he made her laugh, that she felt safe when he was around, that sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch, all of that was irrelevant. She had a ranch to save. There was no room for anything else. But her heart was less practical than her head, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the way she felt. July brought scorching heat and the annual roundup. Julia and Lucas spent long days in the saddle, gathering the cattle and checking their condition. It was brutal work, but Lucas never flagged and his presence made it bearable. On the third day, they stopped to rest beside a small creek in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "You are a good rider," Lucas said, passing her the water canteen. "I grew up on horseback," Julia replied. "My father taught me before I could walk." "He taught you well." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the burble of the creek and the distant lowing of cattle. A meadowlark sang somewhere nearby, and a breeze rustled through the leaves overhead. "Lucas," Julia said hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "That limp you have, how did you get it?" He was quiet for a moment, and Julia worried she had overstepped. Then he said, "Horse fell on me 5 years ago, broke my leg in 3 places, healed up mostly, but it never went back to being quite right." "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes. Mostly when the weather changes. It is not bad, just a reminder to be more careful." Julia nodded. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for asking." He looked at her sideways. "Most people notice but do not say anything." "I am not most people." "No," Lucas said softly. "You are not." Their eyes met and held. The air between them felt suddenly charged, heavy with something unspoken. Julia felt her pulse quicken. Lucas leaned slightly closer, and for a wild moment she thought he might kiss her. Then a steer bellowed somewhere nearby, breaking the spell. Lucas pulled back and cleared his throat. "We should get back to work," he said. "Yes," Julia agreed, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "We should." But as they rode back to the herd, Julia could not shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something fundamental and irreversible. That night, she lay awake in her bed and admitted the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with Lucas Bennett. Maybe had already fallen. The thought terrified her. Love made you vulnerable, made you weak. She had seen it with her mother, the way grief had hollowed her out after losing her husband. Julia had sworn she would never let herself need someone that much. But need and want were proving to be more complicated than she had thought. The next morning, She resolved to be more careful to maintain distance. But Lucas made it difficult. He was always there, steady and solid, making her laugh when she was tired, encouraging her when she doubted herself, working beside her like they were partners in this fight to save the ranch. A week later, they rode to town together for supplies. It was a clear day, the sky a brilliant blue overhead. They chatted easily as they rode, and Julia felt her resolution weakening with every mile. In town, they split up, Julia to the general store and Lucas to the feed and grain. Julia was discussing prices with Mr. Henderson when she overheard two women talking nearby. "That is the Porter girl," one of them said, not quite quietly enough. "Heard she has got some cowboy living out at her place." "Living in sin, more like," the other replied. "No proper woman would have a man staying without a chaperone." "Well, her mother always did let her run wild. No wonder she has got no shame." Julia felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. She finished her business quickly and walked out, her jaw clenched. Lucas was waiting by the horses, a bag of grain slung over his shoulder. He took one look at her face and frowned. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," Julia said shortly. "Let us go home." But as they rode out of town, Lucas pressed the issue. "Julia, talk to me. It is nothing. Just town gossip." "About us," she nodded stiffly. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you what they are saying?" "I do not care what they say," Julia said fiercely, "but I do not want you to be uncomfortable. I am not the one they are talking about. They are questioning my reputation. By extension, that questions yours too." Lucas pulled his horse to a stop. Julia stopped beside him, confused. He looked at her intently. "Julia, I do not give a damn what those people say. If you are worried about your reputation, I can leave. But if you are asking me what I want to stay, not just because of the work, but because—" He paused, seeming to struggle for words. "Because I care about you, more than I probably should." Julia felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "Lucas, I know the timing is terrible. I know you have got enough to worry about without me adding to it. But I would be lying if I said you were just my employer. You are more than that. You have been more than that for weeks now." Julia started, then stopped. All her carefully constructed walls were crumbling. "I care about you too, but I am scared. I cannot afford to lose focus, not when the ranch is on the line." "I am not asking you to lose focus," Lucas said gently. "I am just asking you to let yourself be human, to admit that maybe you do not have to do this alone." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. "My mother needed my father so much that when he died, part of her died too. I saw it happen. I cannot let myself need someone like that. Need is not weakness, Julia, and love does not make you less capable. If anything, it makes you stronger." "You do not know that." "I do," Lucas said. "Because you have made me stronger. Being here, working beside you, watching you fight for this place, it has reminded me why I love this life. You did that." A tear slipped down Julia's cheek. Lucas reached out and gently brushed it away with his thumb. The tenderness of the gesture undid her. "I am falling in love with you," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." "I am already in love with you," Lucas replied, "and it terrifies me too, but I would rather be terrified with you than safe without you." He leaned over in his saddle and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Julia kissed him back, letting herself fall into the moment, into the warmth and rightness of it. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling through her tears. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We go home," Lucas said. "We keep working, we save the ranch, and we figure the rest out as we go." Just like that," Julia laughed, the sound bright and free. "All right then. Let us go home." They rode back to the ranch hand in hand, the gossips in town forgotten. Whatever people wanted to say about them did not matter. What mattered was the feeling blooming in Julia's chest, fragile and fierce and real. That evening, after the work was done and supper eaten, they sat together on the porch as the sun set. Lucas had his arm around her shoulders, and Julia leaned into him, marveling at how natural it felt. "When this is over," Lucas said, "when we have saved the ranch and you have made that payment, I want to do this properly. I want to court you the right way." "The right way?" Julia asked, amused. "Flowers calling on you at proper hours, asking permission to take you to the county fair." "All of it. Lucas, we have been living and working together for 2 months. I think we have moved past the courting stage." "Humor me," he said with a smile. "I want to do at least some things properly." "All right," Julia agreed, "but I draw the line at you asking my father's permission." "That would be difficult, given the circumstances." "Fair enough." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead. Julia felt a peace she had not known in months, maybe years. For the first time since her parents died, she did not feel alone. August arrived with the county fair. True to his word, Lucas asked Julia properly if he could accompany her, complete with a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked that morning. Julia accepted with mock solemnity, biting back a smile. The fair was held in Lusk over 3 days. There were livestock competitions, horse races, pie contests, and a dance on the final evening. Julia had not attended in years, but with Lucas beside her, she found herself enjoying it. They walked through the livestock pavilions, critiquing the entries and making plans for their own herd. They ate roasted corn and pie, and Lucas won her a ribbon at the shooting contest. As evening fell on the final day, music drifted from the pavilion where the dance was being held. Lucas offered his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Porter?" he asked formally. "You may, Mr. Bennett," Julia replied with a grin. The pavilion was strung with lanterns, and a local band played enthusiastically, if not always on key. Lucas led her onto the floor and pulled her into his arms. He was a decent dancer, and Julia followed his lead easily. "I have not danced since my mother passed," Julia said as they swayed to the music. "I had forgotten how much I enjoy it." "We should do it more often then," Lucas said. "There is not exactly a ballroom at the ranch." "Does not need to be. Just you, me, and maybe a harmonica player if we can convince one to visit." Julia laughed. "You are ridiculous. You love it." "I do," she said, and then blushed at the admission. Lucas spun her out and back, his eyes warm. "Good, because I intend to keep making you laugh for a very long time." They danced until their feet ached, then walked back to where they had tied the wagon for the night. The ride home was peaceful, the summer air soft against their skin. Julia leaned against Lucas's shoulder, content in a way she had never expected to feel again. "This has been a good day," she said. "It has," Lucas agreed, "but there will be many more. You sound awfully confident." "That is because I am. We are going to make this work, Julia. The ranch, us, all of it." Julia wanted to believe him. For the first time, she thought maybe she could. September came too quickly. The cattle sale was scheduled for the 2nd week of the month, and Julia felt the pressure mounting. Everything depended on getting a good price. She and Lucas spent days preparing, selecting the best animals, checking their health, making sure everything was perfect. The night before the sale, Julia could not sleep. She paced the house until Lucas appeared at the door, alerted by the lamplight. "You are going to wear a hole in the floor," he said gently. "I cannot stop thinking about tomorrow. What if the prices are down? What if I cannot get enough?" Lucas stepped inside and took her hands in his. "Then we will figure something out, but worrying about it tonight will not change anything. Come sit with me." He led her to the porch, and they sat together in the darkness. Lucas was quiet, his presence a steady anchor for her spiraling thoughts. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said finally, "we face it together. You are not alone in this anymore." "I know," Julia whispered. "That is the only thing keeping me sane." Then hold on to that, and trust that we have done everything we can." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his certainty. "What did I do to deserve you? You mended a fence alone, and I was lucky enough to ride by." Julia smiled despite her nerves. "Best decision I never want to make. I will remind you of that when you are mad at me someday. I will hold you to it." The sale began at dawn. Julia and Lucas drove the cattle to Lusk, where buyers from across Wyoming and neighboring states had gathered. The pens were full of lowing cattle, and the air smelled of dust and manure and nervous anticipation. Julia watched the first few sales, trying to gauge the mood of the buyers. Prices seemed fair, maybe even slightly higher than last year. She felt the knot in her stomach loosen slightly. When their cattle came up for auction, Julia held her breath. Lucas stood beside her, his hand finding hers and squeezing reassuringly. The auctioneer began his chant, and the bids started coming. Julia had feared they would struggle to meet her target price. Instead, two buyers got into a bidding war, driving the price steadily higher. When the gavel finally fell, she had exceeded her goal by nearly 20%. She turned to Lucas, hardly believing it. "We did it." "You did it," Lucas corrected. "These are your cattle, your ranch." "Our ranch," Julia said firmly. "I could not have done this without you." Lucas pulled her into a hug, right there in front of everyone. Julia did not care who saw. Let them gossip. She had just saved her family's ranch, and the man she loved was beside her. They collected payment and went directly to the bank. Mr. Cartwright looked surprised to see them, then impressed when Julia counted out the full payment plus interest. "I must say, Miss Porter, I did not think you would manage it," he admitted. "You have proven me wrong." "I had help," Julia said, glancing at Lucas. "Good help." Outside the bank, Julia felt giddy with relief. The weight that had been crushing her for months was finally, blessedly gone. She had done it. They had done it. "Now what?" Lucas asked, grinning at her obvious joy. "Now we go home," Julia said, "and we celebrate. And then we plan for next year, because we are going to make this ranch better than it has ever been." "That is a lot of plans." "I am a woman with plans now," Julia said. "Get used to it." Lucas laughed and kissed her soundly, right there on the main street of Lusk. This time Julia definitely did not care who saw. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the land that was secure again. Julia felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "I have been thinking," Lucas said carefully. "About what?" "About doing things properly, about courting you the right way." "Lucas, we are well past that stage. I know. But there is one thing I want to do the traditional way." He shifted, and suddenly he was on one knee in front of her. Julia's breath caught. "Julia Porter," Lucas said, pulling a simple silver ring from his pocket. "I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you fight for what matters. I want to spend the rest of my life working beside you, building a life together, facing whatever comes as partners." "Will you marry me?" Julia felt tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger and she pulled him up and kissed him. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. "Where did you get a ring?" Julia asked, looking at the simple band. "Bought it a month ago," Lucas admitted. "Been carrying it around waiting for the right moment." "This is perfect," Julia said. "Everything is perfect." "Not quite everything yet," Lucas said, "but it will be." They were married in October, in a simple ceremony at the church in Lusk. Julia wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers from the ranch. Lucas wore his Sunday best and could not stop smiling. The whole town turned out, even the gossips who had questioned Julia's reputation. Nobody could deny that the two of them belonged together. The winter was hard, as winters always were in Wyoming, but Julia and Lucas faced it together. They spent long evenings by the fire, planning improvements for the spring, talking about the future. Lucas proved to be good with numbers and helped Julia organize the ranch finances better than she had ever managed alone. In March, Julia discovered she was pregnant. Lucas was so excited he nearly fell off the porch when she told him. He became impossibly protective, trying to take over all the heavy work, until Julia finally told him she was pregnant, not an invalid, and he needed to trust her to know her own limits. Their son was born in early November, just as the first snow was falling. They named him Thomas, after Julia's father. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's steady gaze, and Lucas cried when he held him for the first time. "He is perfect," Lucas whispered, staring down at the tiny bundle in his arms. "He is loud," Julia said tiredly from the bed, but she was smiling. "All the best people are," Lucas replied. "The ranch thrived under their joint management." Over the next few years, they expanded the herd, improved the water systems, and built a reputation for quality cattle. They hired help during busy seasons, and Julia taught Lucas the accounting her father had taught her. Together, they turned the struggling ranch into a prosperous operation. 3 years after Thomas was born, they had a daughter. They named her Sarah, after Julia's mother. She was fierce and stubborn from the day she was born, and Lucas said she took after her mother in the best possible ways. 2 years after Sarah came another son, Michael. He was quiet and thoughtful, content to watch the world with serious eyes. The house that had once been so silent was now filled with laughter and crying and the chaos of children. Julia sometimes stood on the porch in the evenings, watching her family, and marveled at how much her life had changed. 5 years ago, she had been alone, struggling, certain she would lose everything. Now she had Lucas, 3 beautiful children, and a ranch that was finally, truly thriving. Lucas would come up behind her at these moments and wrap his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he would ask. "How lucky I am," Julia would reply. "How different everything turned out from what I expected. Better or worse?" "Better," Julia would say firmly. "So much better." The years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the cattle and the land as much as his parents did. Sarah was wild and fearless, always climbing something or racing her horse faster than she should. Michael was the gentle one, the peacemaker, the one who noticed when people were sad and tried to help. When Thomas turned 10, Lucas began teaching him the more complex aspects of ranch management. The boy took to it naturally, asking intelligent questions and working hard. Julia watched her husband and son together and felt her heart swell with love and pride. Sarah showed less interest in cattle and more in horses. By the time she was 8, she was the best rider on the ranch, fearless and skilled. Julia taught her daughter everything she knew about horses, and Sarah soaked it up like a sponge. Michael loved the garden and the chickens, preferring the smaller, quieter tasks. Lucas never tried to force him into more masculine pursuits, understanding that everyone contributed in their own way. The ranch expanded further. They bought adjacent land when old man Wilson finally passed and his children wanted to sell. The extra acreage meant more grazing land and better water access. The debt to the bank was long paid off, and now they were able to save, to plan for the future, to invest in improvements. Julia became something of a legend in the area, a woman who had saved her family's ranch and built it into something more. Young women sometimes came to her for advice, and she was always generous with her knowledge, remembering how alone she had once been. Lucas was respected throughout the county as a fair man and a skilled rancher. He served on the board of the Cattlemen's Association and helped settle disputes between neighbors. The limp that had once marked him as an outsider had become just another part of who he was, noticed but not remarked upon. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Julia to Denver for a week. It was the first time they had left the ranch since their honeymoon, and Julia was nervous about leaving the children with Lucas's brother, who had moved to Wyoming the year before. But Denver was exciting, full of electricity and modern conveniences that seemed miraculous to people used to ranch life. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in restaurants, and went to the theater. It was wonderful, but by the end of the week, both were homesick for Wyoming and their children. "I love our life," Julia said on the train ride home. "I would not trade it for all the cities in the world." "Neither would I," Lucas agreed, "though the indoor plumbing was nice. We could install indoor plumbing." "We could," Lucas said thoughtfully. "It would make winter a lot more pleasant." They did install indoor plumbing the next year, along with a second story on the house to accommodate their growing family. Sarah got her own room finally, which she decorated with pictures of horses. The boys shared a larger room, which they were content with. The ranch hands they employed began to think of the place as a second home. Lucas and Julia treated them fairly, fed them well, and paid decent wages. Several men worked for them for years, becoming almost part of the family. When Thomas turned 15, he announced he wanted to go to the new agricultural college in Fort Collins. Julia's first instinct was to say no, that they needed him at the ranch, but Lucas encouraged her to let him go. "He will learn things that can help us," Lucas pointed out. "And he will come back. This place is in his blood." Lucas was right. Thomas spent 2 years at college, learning about modern ranching techniques and animal husbandry. He came home full of ideas, and he and Lucas spent hours discussing new methods and improvements. Some worked better than others, but the ranch continued to prosper. Sarah, at 13, declared she wanted to raise and train horses professionally. Julia and Lucas helped her start small, and within a few years, horses bearing the Porter brand were sought after across Wyoming for their quality and temperament. Michael discovered a talent for woodworking. He made beautiful furniture and practical items for the ranch, and eventually started selling his work in town. Lucas built him a proper workshop in one of the outbuildings, and Michael spent hours there, content in his craft. Julia and Lucas watched their children grow and find their paths with pride. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch as they had always done, talking about the day, making plans, simply being together. "You ever regret it?" Julia asked one evening. They were both in their 40s now, their hair showing gray, their hands marked by years of work. "Stopping to help me that day. You could have had an easier life somewhere else." Lucas looked at her like she was crazy, not for a single second. "This life, you, our children, this ranch, it is everything I ever wanted, more than I ever dreamed possible. Even when Sarah let those horses loose and we spent 3 days rounding them up, even then. Even when the creek flooded and we lost half the north pasture, even then. Even when I was so pregnant with Michael I could not see my own feet and I made you rub them every night for 3 months." Lucas laughed. "Especially then." Julia leaned into him. "I love you, Lucas Bennett. 15 years later I love you more than I did the day we married." "Only 15 years," Lucas teased. "I feel like I have loved you for much longer." "You have. You just did not know it yet when you stopped to help with that fence." "Maybe," Lucas allowed. "Or maybe I knew it the moment I saw you, covered in dirt, swearing at a fence post, too stubborn to admit you needed help." "I was not that bad. You were exactly that bad, and I loved you for it." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The ranch stretched out before them, peaceful and prosperous. In the distance, they could hear their children laughing about something, the sound carrying on the evening breeze. The years continued their march. Thomas married a girl from town and brought her to live at the ranch. She was smart and hardworking, and Julia welcomed her as the daughter she had always hoped for. They had 3 children, and the ranch house rang with even more laughter and chaos. Sarah married a horse trainer from Colorado, and they built a house on the far edge of the property. Their partnership in horse breeding became legendary, and people came from 3 states away to buy their stock. Michael married late, to a schoolteacher who shared his quiet ways. They moved to town but visited often, and Michael's furniture was in every room of the ranch house. Lucas and Julia became grandparents 8 times over. They loved it, spoiling the grandchildren in ways they had never indulged their own children. The ranch remained the center of the family, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. As they aged, they gradually turned over more responsibilities to Thomas and his wife. Julia taught her daughter-in-law everything she knew about managing a ranch household, about stretching resources and planning for hard years. Lucas worked side by side with Thomas, teaching him the subtle art of reading cattle and land. When Julia turned 55, she and Lucas took another trip, this time to San Francisco. It was even more overwhelming than Denver had been, full of noise and people and strange new inventions. But again, they were both happy to return home. "I am a ranch woman," Julia declared as they rode up the long drive to their home. "I always will be." "And I am a ranch man," Lucas agreed. "This is where we belong." They were right. The ranch was not just their livelihood, it was their soul. Every fence post held memories. Every pasture had stories. The land was in their blood, woven into who they were. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. The house was full to bursting with children and grandchildren, laughter and love. Lucas made a speech, talking about the day he had ridden up and seen a stubborn woman wrestling with a fence post, and how that moment had changed his life forever. Julia stood beside him, their hands intertwined, and looked out at the faces of the family they had built together. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and more love than she had ever thought possible. To Julia, Lucas said, raising his glass, "Who saved a ranch, took a chance on a drifter, and built a legacy that will last for generations." To Lucas, Julia replied, "Who stopped to help a stranger and never left. Thank you for staying." They kissed while their family cheered and the grandchildren made exaggerated sounds of disgust. It was perfect, all of it, exactly as it should be. The years were kind to them. They grew old together, their bodies slowing but their minds sharp, their love deepening with every passing season. They became the patriarch and matriarch of not just their family but the whole community, respected and beloved. They sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sun set over land that had been Julia's family's for 3 generations now, and would continue for at least 2 more. The fence line they had mended together that first day still stood, reinforced and maintained over the years but fundamentally unchanged. "You remember that day?" Julia asked Lucas one evening. They were both in their 70s now, weathered and worn but still here, still together. "The day you rode up. Every detail," Lucas said. "You were wearing a blue shirt, your hair was falling out of its braid, and you looked like you wanted to murder that fence post." Julia laughed. "I did want to murder it, and then you appeared like some kind of miracle." "Not a miracle," Lucas corrected gently. "Just a man who was in the right place at the right time." "No," Julia said firmly. "A miracle, because what are the odds that you would ride up that specific day, that I would be stubborn enough to let you help, that we would fall in love and build this life? It is a miracle, Lucas. Our whole life together is a miracle." Lucas squeezed her hand. Then I am grateful for every miraculous day." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead. Somewhere in the house, their great-grandchildren were playing. The sounds of family surrounded them, the legacy they had built together. "No regrets?" Lucas asked softly. "Not a single one," Julia replied. "You?" "Only that I did not kiss you sooner," Lucas said with a smile. Julia laughed. "We had time, we have had so much time." "And we will have more," Lucas said. "All the time we need." He was right. They had years yet. Years of watching their family grow, of tending the land they loved, of sitting on this porch together as the sun set and rose again. The ranch that Julia had nearly lost had become a thriving legacy. The fence that had brought them together still stood, a symbol of their partnership, their love, and the life they had built one post at a time. Julia rested her head on Lucas's shoulder and looked out at the land she loved, with the man she loved beside her. She had been mending fences alone, and a cowboy had joined her and never left. It was the best thing that had ever happened to her, and she thanked God for it every single day. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, Julia and Lucas remained on the porch, their hands intertwined, their hearts full. The ranch was quiet around them, peaceful and prosperous, exactly as it should be. They had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone. And that, Julia thought with deep satisfaction, was the best legacy anyone could ask for.